Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and I'm going to be providing my general outlook on the current market. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, obviously, the market most recently has been going down for a few weeks, and we are now well below the bull market support band. You guys know we follow that bull market support band a lot. The reason being, what happens when we're below it? Altcoins bleed against Bitcoin on every shakeout. Okay, we talked about this in the last video. And the problem when we're down here and have shakeouts are that altcoins never quite recover back to where they were before Bitcoin had its previous shakeout. When Bitcoin's above the 20-week moving average, like over here, and in these phases, we know that altcoins can quickly recover, and then they can quickly go to new all-time highs. And they're relatively unfazed by what Bitcoin is doing. However, when it's in these areas down here, and every sort of micro pump gets immediately sold, altcoins just bleed against Bitcoin. And that's the reason why we cover this bull market support band so much, is because anytime we're above it, market is relatively bullish. We can move through pullbacks relatively easy. When we're below it, everyone's generally bearish, and altcoins usually get wrecked against Bitcoin. But I wanted to give a general outlook on the market here. So, a lot of people there's all sorts of theories, right? Everyone has a theory. Everyone's following some theory. And you guys know my opinion. I've said for the entire year that 2021 is mostly just going to be a sideways year, okay? I didn't originally think that it would just be sideways, but as we ended 2020, it was hard for me to imagine this rally continuing this quickly for very long, okay? And that was why I said, all right, guys, 2021, mostly going to be a sideways year, okay? We discussed the summer lull back over here. We said, look, guys, we are too far ahead of schedule. We need to have a summer lull at the very least, 3 to 6 months, and then we can, probably put in new all-time highs. And we did that, right? We did that. Since then, we have had a pullback. Now, one of the things I think is interesting is, again, looking at it against M2. So we're going to do that as well. So let us go look at Bitcoin divided by M2. And we're going to be looking at a lot of these different charts to try to make some sense of what's going on in the market. Okay, so this is Bitcoin divided by M2. And one of the interesting things, as we've said before, is the prior summer lull tested the 2017 all-time high when accounting for the money supply. Of course, if you don't account for the money supply, we know that we did not test the prior all-time high because we only went down to 29K, and the prior all-time high was just below 20K. So there's a difference, but again, you have to consider that all the money printing is going to have some effects on the market, okay? So Bitcoin divided by M2. Now, one of the reasons that we were discussing before, it doesn't really feel like Bitcoin has had a significant breakout since early 2020, right? I mean, if you think about it, right, let's just be critical of Bitcoin here. Let's not be biased in any way. Not since early 2020, early 2021. Let's not be biased in any way and just say, well, what has Bitcoin accomplished this year after it put in the new all-time high at 58K in early 2021? I mean, we know that the move to 42K was pretty substantial, but after that, this all-time high at 58K, as you can see over here, since then, these are all pumps for ants, right? No one cares about it going up a couple $1,000s. Even if by stroke of luck, Bitcoin were to go back up a few weeks from now, and then it went to, say, $73,000 and then came back down to 50K, everyone would still be like, all right, well, what's going on? Why is it not putting in new all-time highs in a convincing manner? Right? Where's the actual move? Right? Where's the actual move? Well, when looking at this chart, as we've noted before, if you don't account for the money supply, we did in fact put in a weekly close above the prior all-time high. And I think it was at that point that a lot of people were basically calling for an immediate parabolic rally to end 2021. Bitcoin goes to, a couple $100,000, and then it comes back down. We all go home for 2022, and we come back and rinse and repeat it in a year or two. But as I've maintained for a long time, there's no good reason Bitcoin needs to go parabolic in 2021 especially given how bullish 2020 was, and given the fact that we're trying to get accustomed to what the new normal is. Okay, when Bitcoin moves up 10x, it does take a considerable amount of time for Bitcoin to become accustomed to that new price point. Now, when accounting for the money supply, we did not, in fact, put in a weekly close higher than the prior all-time high. We did technically put in a new all-time high on this wick, but it was just barely. So since then, you can see we've held extreme resistance at this level. Okay, we have not really managed to surpass it, and we've come back down. Now, currently, Bitcoin is trading for around $47,000, and people keep asking me, well, how low do I think it's going to go? One of the things we've discussed before is the fair value. Okay, so we're going to talk about the fair value, and we've also discussed the bull market support band. And we've noticed before that anytime Bitcoin has held the bull market support band, we have not gone below that level, okay? And we held it at around 40K, okay? We had a wick down to 39K, but it was around 39 to 40K is where we held the bull market support band, more or less $40,000, okay? And we've never gone below previously where we held it. I'm not saying we can't, okay? I'm not saying that. But if you look at prior times where Bitcoin held the bull market support band, we have not ever retested those prices. The last time being at $10,000. Now, I don't see Bitcoin going back to 10K. Okay, I know some people are saying it's going to go back to 10K. They're saying the same thing back over here. I don't see it going back to 10K. I don't see it going back to 15K. One of the things I see a lot of people do is they say, well, in a bear market, Bitcoin has to drop 85%. Well, it's true that it has historically dropped 85%, 80%, 90% in bear markets. However, those bull markets that preceded those bear markets were generally filled by mania phase blow-off tops that then got immediately sold and we just did not recover from. This blow-off top here dropped about 70% in the matter of a few weeks. Right? Currently, Bitcoin is down about 31%. Okay, so currently it's about down 31%. But you can see that this is not really the definition of a blow-off top like what we saw back at the end of 2017. And it's actually somewhat similar to over here. In fact, you can look at 42K and say that's a little bit more symbolic of what a potential blow-off top could have looked like if we had then come back down and continued something like that. But we didn't, right? I mean, we started to come back down, and then we went up into this local top distribution phase. And we've covered that many times in the past, okay? So the first thing we should say is that we know that when Bitcoin holds the line at the 20-week moving average, historically, we have not gone below it, okay? And that is 40K. I would also say in the short term, until we get back above the bull market support band, which currently ranges from 52 to 53K, we're just playing in the sandbox. I mean, at this point, we're playing in the sandbox. I would say the market is relatively unexciting until we get back above those levels, and it could be a little while. To give you my general outlook over the next few weeks, I still realize that a lot of people are calling for still a parabolic rally just around the corner, right? Every week they say, oh, it's just going to come next week. Look, I don't think that's going to happen. I think at the very least we have a long way to go before we're going to be putting in a parabolic rally. Okay, we have a ways to go. We're currently below the bull market support band. We would actually need to establish support above that again and then trend higher. That is a long process. I would not anticipate it happening this year. I would also likely not anticipating having a parabolic rally to finish in January or February for that matter. Okay, so I would say that you're going to be much more successful navigating this market if you put these sort of ridiculous short-term price predictions aside, okay? Because they're somewhat meaningless. It's easy for people to just constantly claim there's going to be a parabolic rally next week just to keep you on the edge of your seat. And then every week they just say, oh, it's going to happen next week. Okay, don't fall into that. Look at the market for what it is. Right now, Bitcoin is in a downtrend, and we need to break that downtrend. And once we break that downtrend, we need to go sideways for a little while to establish support. And then once we establish support, we need to go up. Then we need to get back above the bull market support band and then hold it as support, and then we need to trend higher. That is a process. That is not something that just happens in 1 week. It's not something that happens in 2 weeks. So first of all, you need to have the right outlook on the market. You need to have the right perspective on the market. When I look at this market, what I see is I see potential support at 40K if we drop that low. If we go down to 40K, I see a decent amount of support at that level. And it seems like at the very least we would get a sizable bounce off of that level if we even make it there. But what I also notice, historically speaking, is that as long as we stay above the fair value logarithmic regression line, the market cycle is still intact. Okay, if we fall below it, like we did here, we got an accumulation phase coming. Now, that metric is actually not ideal for figuring out if a bear market is started, because by the time you break below it, you've already experienced the majority of the losses you would have experienced from the local top, right? I mean, you would have already experienced a majority of those losses. Therefore, someone then coming here to say sell their Bitcoin, well, I mean, what's the point, right? And you already broke through the band, and at this point, it's just another long accumulation phase. The same thing over here. I mean, yeah, you could have sold your Bitcoin, and look, I mean, in the short term, it would have done relatively well, but then it just bounced right back up to prices higher than you sold it for just a couple months before. Furthermore, over here, when we held it as support and stayed above it, we were able to continue on to put in another all-time high. Okay. In 2017, once we broke below it, again, it's not the best indicator for saying, hey, this is the bear market, but it is an indicator to say, all right, you are now entering into a long accumulation phase, and you should at least expect that accumulation phase to last a year. Okay. Because a lot of people watching experienced the 2018 bear market, to give you an idea, we didn't fall below it until Bitcoin was at $5,500, which was part of that final capitulation crash. So if you find yourself in the future, whether it's in the next 6 months, 18 months, 36 months, whatever it is, whenever we fall below that band, it doesn't really mean that that's the best time to sell your Bitcoin. What it does mean is that you're probably looking at least a year-long accumulation phase before we can realistically trend higher. Now note that this did get a trend up in 2019, but even that was sold off, and we sort of held resistance there at the top of that band and then came right back down for about another year or so before actually breaking back above. So that brings me to my next point, right? Well, what is the value at today? What is the fair value logarithmic regression band for Bitcoin today? Well, today it's at 25.7K. Or sorry, no, that's the lower band on it. The fair value is 31.3K. Okay, so 31.3K is the fair value according to this fair value logarithmic regression fit of Bitcoin. Now the band ranges from 25.7 up to 38K. Okay, so previously this year we held it as support at 31K at the top of the band. Right now, that same band, again, it ranges from 25.7 all the way up to 38K. So it's a pretty large range, right? It's a pretty large range. So I as you guys know, I'm an advocate of lengthening cycles. I think that this cycle has a long way to go. Do I think we're going to go back to $10,000? It's been a couple years hanging out between $10,000 to $15,000. I do not. But I also don't see us having a parabolic rally next week that's going to take us to 100K. So I just want to be realistic and keep people down to earth with realistic expectations and not to just constantly expect these crazy rallies that everyone keeps predicting. Wait, be conservative, be patient, wait for the rally to come to you. Until then, you gotta somewhat ignore these price predictions in the short term. So, what are some other things we can look at, right? How could we see this cycle playing out? What's some potential paths? And this is where people say, "Oh, you're saying it could go up or down." Look, no one knows what's going to happen in the short term, and if you think someone does know, you should follow that person, right? If you know someone that knows what's going to happen in the short term, then I want to follow that person because I don't know. I mean, I would argue that it's a random walk. That momentum is the most likely thing to follow. That one of the best things to follow. Right now, the trend is down. We need to stop that downtrend. Until then, you basically have to expect that the price could go lower because if you don't, then you basically just keep screaming that this is the bottom over and over and over again, and then eventually we get it. But I would say be realistic here. Okay, so the potential paths that I think this, if we do get a lengthened cycle, that this could take, I think the best path would just to say that 42K is the bottom, 42K, the prior local top. Because I know a lot of people are sort of looking at that 42K level as saying like if we drop below 42K, then that's it, right? It's just simply all there is. We cannot recover from 42K if we go below it. So that would obviously be the most, optimistic solution, especially since we've already tested it, right? I mean, I know this wick doesn't show it, but on some exchanges we already tested 42K, so that would be the most optimistic solution to this. It's just 42K is the bottom, and we're ultimately going to trend higher and break out to the upside, all right? Another one would be to say 40K, and 40K, the reason I say that one, of course, is because that's where we held the line at the bull market support band, right? At 40K. Seems somewhat reasonable to think that it could hold as support in the future, even if trying to hold it as support is not on the bull market support band, because the bull market support band is now over 50K. But it still would be at least an area of interest to watch. The more bearish scenario, but still theoretically possible in line with lengthening cycles, would be going back down to the logarithmic regression band, bouncing out of it, and then continuing on. But look, you know, there's always got to be some invalidation for these theories. You can't just hang on to them forever. I do think lengthening cycles will play out. But look, I mean, if Bitcoin comes back down here and then drops back down to $10,000, $15,000 like the bears are calling for, then look, I mean, there's nothing more you can say. The theory will no longer stand up. But you can imagine that holding it here and then trending higher, I think history would view that as a lengthened cycle. Going back to 40K and holding it, I think history would view that as a lengthened cycle. I think where it becomes a little bit fuzzy is how low can you realistically go and still call it a lengthened cycle. Now, if you go down to 30K, which is where we went back to in July, right? May, June, and July, and we end up just getting this entire long reaccumulation phase, sideways action between 30 and 60K, I would still argue that if we bounce off of those levels like we did back in the summer, then it still looks like a long cycle, right? Just a long reaccumulation phase. We had these long reaccumulation phases last cycle. They weren't quite as long, but there were still certainly phases where Bitcoin just went more or less sideways for upwards of half a year. And it ranged between, say here, it ranged between $360 all the way up to $500. And it was just sideways action. Okay, so we've seen these phases before where Bitcoin can just go sideways. And furthermore, one would expect that a cycle that is lengthened should have even longer sideways periods, right? You would expect for it to even go longer than that. So then I look at this and say, well, it is still theoretically possible that we could revisit those lows. However, I do imagine if we went down to that level, if we came all the way back down to this level, I would imagine that most people would think the cycle is over at that point. That would certainly be an interesting thing if that were to play out, to see what would happen, because, you know, 30K held us support here, 60K or, you know, 64K resistance, 69K resistance. This was 29K support. That would be the more bearish option, I think, would be something like that, where you could still argue that lengthening cycles are still in play. And if you go over here and look at what happened in 2013, and we zoom in here, we actually had a wick down to the bottom of that regression line, but it only lasted for, you know, it was less than a week. It was just a wick on a weekly candle. We spent most of the time above the fair value. Okay, so look, I wouldn't look to be spending a lot of time in this region, because then the bears would just get, I think the bears would just get too far in control if something like that were to happen. So realistically, we don't want to go down to those levels, right? We don't want to go down to 25K, because then you're getting into the territory where only one more dump is going to get you to 20K, and then you can have a capitulation to 15K, etc. And then the bear narrative would play out. But I think there's a lot of potential support here at these levels, 42K, 40K, and even 30K for that matter, if we make it down that low, would still offer a decent amount of support. Which brings me to another point. You know, we put out a video a while back talking about, well, can we learn anything from the stock market? And look, I mean, I wasn't trading back in the early 2000s. Okay, I mean, in 2000 I was only 10 years old, so it's not like I had a trading account and was trading equities. But it is sometimes interesting to try to figure out how have the markets behaved in the past. And just to make the video all inclusive, just to look at the S&P, there was a similar type of structure like we're seeing now, where you get this, this major rally, and then you get that pretty significant pullback, okay, followed by another push to the upside, and then it ultimately ended up being, sort of a double top where the second top technically put in a new all-time high. Technically speaking, it put in a new all-time high. What's interesting for this is also was more or less a double bottom as well. Okay, with actually a wick down below. So I imagine that when this broke, I'm guessing a lot of people would have immediately thought that, hey, this is it. We're going to go back down here. And in fact, we didn't. We actually came back up, tested that prior all-time high. Okay, we tested that prior all-time high, and then we immediately broke out of it. We actually went above it from 155 up to 169, came back down for a retest of it, and then that was all she wrote. And since then, you can see what has happened. I mean, the stock market has just been trending up ever since. Okay, so that is an interesting outlook. And you can also see the time frame. If you're wanting to think about dubiously speculating on time frames here, this peak here, the separation between that peak and then this peak was about 395 weeks. But then the second one, this one was only about 281 weeks. Okay, so let's just say this is close enough to 400 weeks. This is close enough to 300 weeks. So it's about 3/4 of the time. If we were to go look at Bitcoin and say, well, what sort of time frame could we be looking at if it were to emulate what happened, what people experienced back then, you'd be talking about 30 weeks here. Okay, so then you'd be talking about 3/4 of that. Okay, so the point is to say, if you were to say measure out, if you were to measure out 30 weeks and just say it's going to take the same amount of time, that would be looking at about summer of 2022. Obviously, you could pull that back a little bit if you wanted to, to try to convincingly say, well, it's going to play out the same way. Then it could be, maybe Q2 of 2022, early Q2 as well, for some pattern to play out like that, where it comes down and then comes back up and then breaks out. What you do notice, though, is on the third attempt, we broke out, and then that was all she wrote, right? We actually decidedly broke out, and then we just started flying off to the races, okay? And then now we've been enjoying this bull market. If you're like me, and you've been investing for the for the last decade or so, we've been enjoying this macro bull market for the stock market, right? But you can imagine that what people experienced before that was pretty brutal during this phase, right? I mean, up and down, and then up, and then all the way back down, and then on the third attempt, we actually broke through. So going back to Bitcoin, and thinking about like what's a realistic outlook here, I think that anyone that claims to know the bottom is fooling themselves. I think there is probably a lot of support at 42K, at 40K, and then even at the prior local bottom that we saw back in July, May, June, and July. Okay, I think there's a lot of support at those levels. I've argued for the entire year that Q4 does not need to be a parabolic year. I've argued for the entire year that 2021 is mostly just going to be sideways. I think that if we keep range bound between 30 and 60K, it's going to be hard to dispute that. I mean, if we're just between 30 and 60K, all we're doing is going sideways for a long period of time. And we've been at these levels since late 2020, early 2021, more or less. Okay, and we started the year off just below $30,000, but arguably we have just been going sideways for a majority of the year. So what I'm looking for going forward, for me, again, this is my outlook on the market, and I'm allowed to have my outlook on the market, is not a bear market that's going to take us back to $10,000. I'm not looking for something like that. But what I am looking for is I'm looking for Bitcoin to bottom, to go sideways, and then to start trending higher. And then whenever that happens, whether it starts going up at 42K, whether it starts at 40K, or whether it even tests the lows from the summer, what I'm looking for at that point is to come back up to the prior all-time high, to break it, and then to ultimately trend higher, and then hopefully prove lengthening cycle theory is correct, and to continue along the way. Now, another thing I'd like to point out, because I get this question all the time, look, the obvious extrapolation of lengthening cycles is that eventually they'll become too subjective to discern one from another. Okay, if the first cycle was a year, and the second cycle was 2.5 years, and the third cycle is 4 years, if the fourth cycle ends up being 5 or 6 years, and then you have a fifth cycle that's 7 or 8 years, at some point it just becomes so subjective that no one really cares anymore, because then a majority of market participants probably would not have bought at the bottom because you would have had a whole decade basically for new participants to come in. So they're not going to really care so much about it. So eventually I do think it'll sort of more evolve into something that looks more like the stock market than something that where we have these repeatable cycles. Okay. And this is something we've been saying since 2019. Okay. Eventually they'll sort of just merge together and it'll be hard to distinguish one from another. If you don't know what I'm talking about, another way to visualize that, of course, is to look at the market cycle ROI. And what it does is it shows you just how silly future cycles ROI, the future cycles ROI is going to be compared to this one. Right? If you look at a linear scale and you look at say, cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3, this is cycle 4 that you can barely make it out. Right, so imagine what a theoretical cycle 5 could look like, or a theoretical cycle 6 if they're just spanning for a decade or something. Right, it just becomes silly at some point. So I do think that lengthening cycles will prevail, this market cycle. Okay, I do think that. And then in a future cycle, it's possible we could identify a macro bottom, but then it's going to become even more subjective, identifying market cycle tops and whatnot, especially if they end up spanning for extremely long periods of time. And so it would more or less look like the stock market. All right. So, another question I've gotten that I think is worth addressing is a lot of times Bitcoin sort of has a catalyst, right? I mean, I don't really talk about the news a lot, and you could argue that Bitcoin's going to go up regardless. It's just the natural order of things that, not to say that the news doesn't necessarily matter, but it's just that, look, on this new types of technology, you would expect certain things to evolve, to unfold, for institutions to come in, for certain things to be developed, and therefore it doesn't really matter in the sense of, look, that was the expectation anyways. I'm not going to report on every piece of breaking news because you kind of more or less expect it to happen regardless. But you have to think, okay, well, what could be a potential narrative that people could get on board with? And back in 2020, it was more so, of course there's DeFi and everything, but it was not just that. It was like institutions are pouring in, right? You got Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy buying Bitcoin. You even had Tesla buying Bitcoin in early 2021. And everyone was jumping on board, right? What's the next one going to be, right? What's the next catalyst? Is it going to be a spot ETF? What's that going to look like? What could be? Is it going to be a major institution buying Bitcoin and announcing it? So I would say, potentially be on the lookout for something like that. You would like to see some type of catalyst to get people talking about it and get people interested in the idea to ultimately see things kind of go the way we think they're going to go. So to sum it up, do I think Bitcoin is going to go back to $10,000? No, I don't think it's going to go back to 10K. I don't think it's going to go back to 15K. But I also said that back in the summer as well. I don't think it's going to go back to those levels. Could we go back to 40K? Yeah, we could. I mean, we're in a downtrend right now. I mean, I think some people have a hard time looking at the data sometimes, but look, right now Bitcoin is in a downtrend. It's indisputable. You can't say, just call it what it is, right? It's in a downtrend. We need to break the downtrend. Until the downtrend is broken, then we need, I'd say it's best to be cautious, right? Be conservative on what you think is going to happen. Be pleasantly surprised if Bitcoin outperforms what your expectations are. So, I'm looking at a potential bounce, as I mentioned, on some of those levels earlier, a retest of the prior all-time highs sometime, not in the next month, right? I think we still have a ways to go before we're going to get there, but I do think it'll come probably sometime in, maybe mid-2022, potentially. Could be a time where we could see that happening. But again, a lot of this, the whole idea is that lengthening cycles will certainly have people questioning if things are over, right? I mean, I think some people think that just because they're around for the last bull market, and now they're an expert on every bull market known to man. That's just simply not true, right? Just because you're around for a prior cycle or a prior bull market does not mean you know exactly what's going to happen every single week of a current cycle. No one knows, right? I don't say that in the way of thinking that I'm better, because I'm not, right? I say that in the sense of no one knows what's going to happen in the short term, and we shouldn't pretend like we do. So I would say let's be cautiously optimistic. That's what I'm looking at right here. I recognize that Bitcoin is in a technical downtrend. It seems likely that we could see lower prices. I'm thinking we'll probably bounce somewhere off the prior levels I mentioned, and eventually I think we'll head back up and test the prior highs, and whenever that happens, I think we'll break through. But it's probably not going to be this month. It's probably not going to be next month. Okay, we need time. We need a lot of time here to ultimately get through this phase. So just wanted to come on, give a general market update for everyone who's following Bitcoin, and a lot of fearful people out there right now. And look, we'll just take it one step at a time. Hopefully we'll come out the other side on this, but again, it's going to be a while. Buckle up and be patient, right? Be patient. If you think this is the bear market that's going to last a couple of years, then that's another story. I mean, if you're convinced it's a bear market, then I imagine you stand on a completely different side of the fence if you think it's going to go back down to, say, $10,000, $15,000. And to give you an idea of where people are getting that 10 to 15K from, they're basically just looking at the prior top there and going down 85% and saying, well, it's going to take us to $10,000. So there's certainly a possibility for anything. But one of the reasons I think that 10K is unlikely, there's actually a couple of reasons why I think 10K is unlikely. One reason is it is below the regression bands. Okay, so the fair value or the regression band fit to quote unquote non-bubble data, the lower bound on that one right now is already at $12,000, over $12,000 in fact. And we don't really visit that area hardly at all during a cycle, okay? We did technically come down during the pandemic crash, and we actually did slightly go below it, but it was very brief, and we're nowhere even close to the regression band right now. You have to imagine that if it is a long bear market, then by the time we could get down to these levels, we'd be well above $12,000. And in fact, in a bear market, typically that 200-week SMA is what normally saves Bitcoin, right? It's that 200-week moving average. Okay, so that would be sort of where to look, and that is already at $18,000. Okay, it's already at 18K. So I do have a hard time seeing it go down to those levels. So I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, I've heard a lot of people say it's going to go down to $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. The 200-week estimate is already at 18.4K. So that should in the event that the floor falls out on 40K and on 30K, I mean, that would be sort of the area where most people, I imagine, would be accumulating in preparation for a future market cycle if lengthening cycles does not play out. All right. So I'll continue to take this 1 week at a time. Okay. And we'll see what ultimately happens. I know a lot of people are fearful right now. Prior high of 69K. It's going to stay like that for a little while. All right. Don't expect it to just come back up immediately and put a new all-time high. We're too far below it at this point, and also we are below the bull market support band, and we have a lot of work to do before we can come back up and test those highs. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. We also do have the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. Thank you for tuning in, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.